Professor David Haskell, thank you for being with us. It's good to see you again. We've had you on the show before, and something that you've just written is making a little bit of waves. You released a paper on Tuesday, and you're doing nothing but interviews, and everyone's talking about it. So what were your findings in this paper?
Well, it's really a research report, Laura-Lynn, that I take everybody else's findings and then I just show them to the public. And what's interesting is these things have been known for quite some time, and there have been meta-analyses done, but the findings have been suppressed or ignored. And so what I've done is I've taken those findings and I've said, we need to pay attention to this. And in fact, here's the main finding. We now know that diversity, equity, and inclusion, that kind of instruction that's ubiquitous across our education system, our businesses, our government, it's not empirically valid. It doesn't work. Not only that, what I was able to show through the examination of the existing research is that not only does it not do good, it can do harm.
Right. I began to get a feeling about something like this when Obama himself was constantly talking about race, and it seemed like there was an increase in racism that went on during the Obama years. Is that a kind of thing that you're looking at?
Yeah, you're right on point. I mean, what you felt in your gut was what the empirical evidence was picking up. So what we know for sure is that the kind of attitudes that we would consider racist, where one group considers themselves superior to another, those kind of attitudes were actually decreasing from about the 1960s onward. And even into the middle of the 2000s, 2010, 2016, things kept getting better and better in terms of racial acceptance between groups. But then around the time of Obama, and really it just hit fever pitch around 2020 with the George Floyd riots, we saw the introduction of this new kind of philosophy, this DEI philosophy that begins to talk about oppressor and oppressed. It also says that discrimination can be a good thing. These are ideas that make society worse. And we can actually see how society is unraveling at this point. We were actually doing the right thing by saying, let's measure people by the content of their character, but then that all changed with DEI.
Wow, and I think that was said by someone famous who was an African American. He said, I want to be judged by the content of my character and not the color of my skin. So do you think we've really gone backwards through what they're doing through this forced, everybody has to look at, the color of people's skins and even LGBTQ issues? Is this all tied in?
Yeah. I mean, when you look at DEI instruction, it really is of two types. So you've got the anti-racist instruction, and that's kind of a tricky name. It's called anti-racist, but at its heart, it actually is very racist. And then you've got the LGBT side of it as well, and that's a very affirming model. So you've got those two branches of DEI training. But what we know from all of this is that when you make something more prevalent, it's called prevalence inflation. You begin to make people think that it's a greater problem. And in DEI specifically, they really do push the notion that discrimination in the present is a good thing because it accommodates discrimination in the past. And that's just madness. That's just madness to think that discrimination today is going to ameliorate something in the past. But that's actually what they talk about in these DEI kind of trainings.
I see here one paragraph says, however, a rudimentary understanding of statistical analysis leads to the conclusion that it is in fact not obvious that differences in outcomes between racial and ethnic cohorts are evidence of racism. Correlation does not equal causation. In fact, in his recent reality check on systemic racism claims in Canada, the Aristotle Foundation's Matthew Lau evaluates the empirical data and comes to this conclusion. If the typical anti-racism activist in Canada today is looking for widespread institutional or systemic racism, they will not find it. That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so at that part in my research report, what I'm doing is I'm holding up one of the claims made in DEI training. And one of the claims they make is that Canada is systemically racist. And what I say as you just read, there's lots of good evidence out there that shows, in fact, that's not the case. When you look at it empirically, when you actually study the quantitative data, you can see that skin color, ethnicity doesn't hold someone back in Canada. And what Matthew Lau found, and you quoted from him there, he found that in Canada, Asian Canadians actually do better in terms of educational attainment and family income than Native whites. So it's so many different pieces come together in DEI. And what the larger studies that are looking at this find is that it just doesn't make people less prejudiced. It doesn't do anything good, but it can do harm. It can actually increase prejudice. So let me dig into that. What they're saying, what the research shows is that when you go to this kind of DEI instruction, or if you read the DEI materials, there's a good chance that you actually activate prejudice. And so we really need to wonder, if I'm able to find this research, which is in top-notch journals done by people from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, if I'm able to find it and bring it to the front like this, why is it being pushed to the back? And I think that one of the explanations is there's a lot of money to be made here. And they don't want the results of these studies to be known. They don't want the results to be known because it would really tap into their bank account.
And where is the money? Is it because the governments are funding this, the different powers that they want this and they'll fund organizations to implement this?
So there are so many different pots of money that we could look at and so many explanations. I'll try to break it down with a few examples. If you were a DEI consultant here in Ontario, where I am, and this is a true to life example, there was a DEI consultant here in Ontario who was hired by the Toronto District School Board. Now remember, Toronto District School Board has its own DEI office. They could have done their own training, not that it would have been effective, but they could have done their own. Instead, they hired this outside contractor. They paid this woman $60,000 for 4 sessions over 4 days done by Zoom. I don't know any other business, like not a lawyer, not a surgeon, that can make that kind of money.
Wow.
So there's that kind of financial imperative. But yeah, you also have to look at, why might the businesses be pushing this? Well, businesses might want to be pushing this because it diverts from any kind of collusion or corruption that they are engaged in. You look at grocery stores that are colluding on the price of bread. We saw that. You look at bank fees for your Interact. You look at the gouging that's done by cell phone companies. You know how you get people not to pay attention to that? You hold up DEI. You say, look at how virtuous we are. Look at how much money we're spending here. Now, from government's perspective, you want to promote DEI because you can then cater to special interest groups. It's a way to buy votes. So when we talk about the finance is multi-layered and pretty nuanced.
So is this why we're seeing articles like this all over the place, how corporate America is slashing DEI workers amid backlash to diversity programs? And I hope that is also carrying out in Canada as well. Are we going to see these kind of positions are going to kind of be going the way of the trash disposal, perhaps, because it's not working and it's causing harm?
Well, we've got some problems here in Canada. And one of the problems is we don't have many politicians with spines. And in the United States, we have politicians who have the courage of their convictions. They also are willing to listen to evidence. But here in Canada, most conservative politicians really govern by the polls. And people tend not to know these things. They don't know that DEI is based on a house of cards. They don't know that DEI is not empirically valid. They only hear what the mainstream media is telling. They only hear what the government is pushing. And so the conservative politicians, they don't want to be the ones who spoil the party. And so as a result, I think that we have a steeper hill here in Canada to climb because we just have politicians who aren't willing to do the heavy lifting.
Wow, and that is sad actually, because then we're kind of always running behind. And when I look at this, I just pulled up diversity and inclusivity jobs, like on LinkedIn, where people go to see what's going on, and it has like thousands and thousands of listings, basically, of people that they want to implement because this is such a politically correct thing, isn't it? Like it's almost as if that every company feels, well, you're sort of in if you have one of these people. And yet what you're finding is that this is harmful and in fact promoting racism. If we're going to start looking at everyone like, oh, so-and-so just got hired because they're Black or they're Asian or they're, Indian, then we're going to have a problem with that, because people might feel that that's not fair. And in actual fact, some people are now beginning to think that, it might be the white male that's actually being discriminated against.
Well, you've hit on, several topics there that really show the problem of putting immutable characteristics as the sole criteria for advancement. And it is not exclusively a Caucasian thing where there's a concern. I mean, Asian Canadians, Asian Americans have felt the bite of DEI themselves. For example, you may remember that just in the last year, the elite universities in the United States, at places like Harvard, North Carolina, they were actually excluding Asian students in the name of diversity. So as it stood, there were Asian students who work super hard and they are diligent, and they were coming in with near perfect test scores. But these elite universities in the US were saying, there are too many Asians applying. That's not what we want. They have this mythical idea of what the right amount of diversity is, or the right kind of diversity is, which again, flies in the face of just the idea of seeing people as individuals, as humans. So there was a court case in the United States. It went to the Supreme Court. And the Asian Americans who were bringing this case forward, they won. The judges said, you know what? These universities are discriminating against you based on race. Unfortunately, in Canada, we don't have that kind of system. In fact, in Canada, under our Constitution, it is actually legal to discriminate against the majority population. In Ontario as well, they've said that it is legal that someone who's Caucasian cannot claim discrimination.
Really? So as long as you're the majority. So if that's true, what happens? I've seen some writings recently stating that, if we look ahead to 2050, there might be a lot more brown people in Canada than white people.
And I actually don't care at all about skin color. This is not my concern at all.
They're making this, right?
Under the skin, people are, I want to know who you are. I want to know what you're like. Yeah. I'm more concerned about your character, your ideas, your attitudes, and your ethics. That's what's important to me. And I think that we had a really great system prior to the advent of the DEI industry. And the really great system from about the 1960s into the 2000s was, let's just judge people according to their merit, competency, and character. And when we did that, we saw racial attitudes go down, we saw acceptance go up. So it was working. So we need to return to that very basic model.
Right. Now, before we let you go, we've got just a few minutes more. I'm hearing what you're saying. And in part of your writing, you say operating under the assumption that society is overrun with intolerance. That's how this has all come in. Operating under the assumption that we're overrun with intolerance. And yet that is not true at all. In fact, myself as a Canadian, I've been very offended to be called racist so many times, even as I'm surrounded by my Chinese friends, my Indo-Canadian friends, I have Muslim friends, and there is not an assumption of racism here in Canada. So this does lead to believe that if you're going to start with that assumption, this is where it all goes wrong from there.
And again, this is really, you've encapsulated one of the key characteristics of DEI. It is not based on evidence. its claims aren't based on evidence, its practices aren't based on evidence. And that's what the report that I did for the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy brings out. It shows that there just is no proof that DEI changes attitudes for the better, and it can cause racism. And the claims that they make during these sessions, like that Canada is awash in racism, there's no justification for that. Notions about implicit bias, they say that people can be subconsciously, unconsciously biased. Again, the evidence for that is zero. They make all of these claims about their concepts: white privilege, implicit bias, systemic racism, which they don't have evidence for. And then they make these other claims about once you've been exposed to it, you'll be a better person. And none of it is valid in terms of the empirical evidence.
You know, personally speaking, there was a young lady, furious. We were at an event downtown Vancouver, and they were all yelling at us that we were racist. And it was funny because it was actually against the sexual orientation and gender teaching that was going on. So they were yelling at us that was racist, which didn't make sense to me. But I said, I'm not racist. I was born in Africa, and I'm really African Canadian. And she didn't like it at all. She says, white people can't be racist. And she was so upset, she started crying, screaming, white people can't claim racism or something like that. Like, we can't even say that you can't be racist to white people is what she was trying to say. And I'm like, but you are being, you know?
Yeah, and again, that really generates from DEI itself, because DEI wants to dehumanize. It'll dehumanize some, and typically it's the majority population, and it will elevate others. And that is just so toxic. There's a really bright guy at Princeton University. His name is Russell Neely, and he's studied not DEI specifically, but really this notion that you can discriminate your way toward flourishing, which you can't. And so in his studies, and he's looked at historical data, he's looked at empirical data, sociological, economic data. What he shows is this. There's this idea of the reciprocity principle. And the reciprocity principle came into fashion in the West largely due to the Christian faith. It said, I'm going to treat other people like I want to be treated. I'm not going to let my tribe get ahead just because they're my tribe. Instead, we're going to have this fairly neutral measure. It's going to be competency and merit. And when you do that, the reciprocity principle says, okay, I'm not letting my tribe get ahead. You don't let your tribe get ahead. We'll base it on this neutral criteria of competency and merit. When that happens, you can have flourishing. But Neely goes on to say, the extent to which you reject this reciprocity principle, the extent to which you begin to say discrimination is a good thing, that is at your peril, and society will start to unravel.
Wow. All right. Well, as we let you go, is the best place to get your article is at where we've outlined that it came out here on
the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. Yeah.
Okay, that is the best place. And if people want to follow you, are you on Twitter?
Yes, D. Millard Haskell. So at D. Millard Haskell on X, formerly Twitter.
Yes, formerly Twitter. It's all confusing. We'll put that in the description. Thank you very much for your time. I know you have another interview to get to. We so appreciate it. Good work. Keep on standing for Canada.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Laura-Lynn. I appreciate it.
It really is. God bless. Take care. Thank you.
Take care.